The respiratory system allows us to obtain the oxygen necessary to drive our metabolism and get rid of the carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of our metabolism. The anatomy of the respiratory system includes the nose and nasal cavity, the pharynx or throat, the larynx or voice box, the trachea, and the bronchi. The function of the respiratory system is to cleanse the air, humidify it, and warm it. The nose is the passageway for air. It warms, moistens, and filters the air. The hairs in the nose help filter the air and take out some of the larger material that's in the air. The walls of the nasal cavities are not perfectly smooth. It's more like a baffling system. There are bony projections that are covered with blood-rich mucus. The mucus helps moisten the air, and the warm blood helps warm the air. As the air comes in through the nose, it has to go through this baffling system so it gets moistened and warmed. Rhinitis is simply an inflammation of the nasal mucosa. Usually excessive mucus production ensues. Various pathogens, particularly viruses, can cause rhinitis, as well as allergens. The pharynx is a structure that is shared with the digestive system. It's a passageway for air and food. This is what we think of as the throat. Pharyngitis is an inflammation of the throat, or basically a sore throat. Bacteria can cause this, viruses can cause this, even overusing your throat can cause this. The larynx has three functions. It keeps an open airway. The word patent is used whenever we want to say a tube is kept open. It is also where we separate the digestive tube from the respiratory tube. So this is the switching region where we direct food to the stomach and air to the lungs. And it acts as our voice box. The vocal folds are housed in the larynx. The larynx is composed of 9 cartilage. One of them is known as the epiglottis. The epiglottis will cover the glottis whenever we swallow. The glottis is the opening to the trachea, so when we're swallowing, we're sending stuff to our stomach. We cover the airway opening so that nothing can get into the lungs. Laryngitis is an inflammation of the vocal folds. It causes hoarseness and sometimes a complete loss of voice. It's caused by dry air, bacterial infections, irritating chemicals, inhaling irritants, or even just overuse. Croup is epiglottitis, an inflammation of the epiglottis. It is most commonly caused by the bacteria Haemophilus influenza. The epiglottis will swell and sometimes can swell to the point that it blocks the airway. The trachea is also known as the windpipe. It extends through the mediastinum and contains elastic elements, so the trachea is pretty flexible. It has to be held open. Air would not open this tube up, so there are C-shaped cartilage that keep the trachea patent or open. The last cartilage, where the trachea divides to go to the right and left bronchial tubes, is called the carina. It's almost kind of heart-shaped. The mucosa of the carina is very sensitive, so if anything comes down here and touches this, dust or irritants or even a little bit of liquid, it can cause severe coughing. The cells of the trachea have the respiratory cilia on their surface. The cilia move material in the opposite direction of air movement, so they're going to move things toward the mouth. Mucus produced by the mucosa of the trachea will trap bacteria and other things that might get into the lungs. The cilia will then beat and move this material to the mouth so that we can get rid of it. We keep it from getting into the lungs. Smoking inhibits cilia movement by paralyzing them. And then if you continue to smoke, it will completely destroy the cilia. This means that mucus will accumulate in the trachea, and the only way you can move it up to the mouth is by coughing. Here you see some of the parts of the respiratory system. The nose and the nasal cavity, and here's all those baffles that the air has to go through to get warmed and moistened. Then we have the pharynx divided into 3 parts. The part right behind the nose is the nasopharynx, right behind the mouth we have the oropharynx, and right above the larynx we have the laryngopharynx. Here is where the trachea becomes the esophagus to take food to the stomach, and here in the front we have the trachea. The epiglottis will cover up the opening to the trachea whenever we swallow. Otherwise, air can then go into the trachea. The Adam's apple is one of the cartilages that make up the larynx. The vocal folds are here in the larynx. The trachea branches into the right and left bronchi. These are known as the primary bronchi. The primary bronchi branch to secondary bronchi. One secondary bronchus goes to each lobe of the lung. The bronchi continue branching and branch up to about 20 times, so we get these tiny, tiny branches that are called the bronchioles. By this point, they're made primarily of smooth muscle. The The bronchioles will then divide into alveolar ducts. This is sometimes referred to as the bronchial tree because the trachea looks like the trunk, and then we have branching, 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 like a tree branching. Here you see the trachea, the right and left bronchus, the secondary bronchi, tertiary, and so on till we get down to these tiny, tiny bronchioles. And the bronchioles are going to lead into the alveolar ducts. The alveolar ducts go into the alveolar sacs. The alveolar sacs are simply clusters of alveoli. Alveoli are individual little air sacs. This is where we will exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. Each little alveolus is covered with a network of capillaries and with a network of elastic fibers. These elastic fibers allow the alveoli to be blown up, and then just like letting air out of a balloon, they will collapse back down. They don't collapse completely. We keep a little air in them, but they do help push air out of them so we can keep refreshing the air in the alveoli. The respiratory membrane is the air-blood barrier. It's only 2 cell layers thick. It has the cells of the alveolar wall, which are epithelial cells, and we have the endothelium of the capillaries. You'll remember that they're only 1 cell layer thick. The two share a basement membrane so that gases can move across the 2 cell layers in this very thin basement membrane. Gas exchange is by simple diffusion. That is, molecules move from a higher area of the molecule to a lower area. So we're going to have more oxygen in the alveolus. It will diffuse into the blood. More carbon dioxide in the blood will diffuse into the alveolus. We also have macrophages that wander in and out of the alveoli, cleaning up any material that may get there that shouldn't be there. This is part of the immune defense of the respiratory system. The right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung has only 2 lobes. Remember, the heart is more on the left side of the body, and that takes up a little bit of the space in the pleural cavity. The pleura is the serous membrane, which is going to line the chest cavity and then fold back and cover the lungs. So the parietal pleura will be up against the chest wall. It will fold back over to cover the lungs, and that will be the visceral pleura. In the little bit of space in between those two, we will have pleural fluid. Pleural fluid will nourish the pleura as well as lubricate it. So as the lungs expand, they can move freely against the inside of the chest wall. Pleurisy is an inflammation of the pleura where the pleura produces a thick, sticky fluid. This fluid makes the 2 layers stick together and makes it very hard to breathe. It's very painful to breathe. A pleural effusion is when there is a collection of fluid in the pleural cavity. Again, this is usually the result of inflammation of the pleura. As the fluid collects between the lung and the chest wall, it puts a lot of pressure on the lungs and makes the lungs very hard to inflate. There are 4 basic steps in respiratory physiology. Pulmonary ventilation, which is breathing, replenishing air in the alveoli. External respiration is the gas exchange between the blood and the lungs. Respiratory gas transport is moving oxygen and carbon dioxide around in the blood, and internal respiration is the gas exchange between the blood and the tissue. Pulmonary ventilation is inspiration and expiration. Inspiration occurs because the intercostal muscles, the muscles between the ribs, and the diaphragm, the muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity, all contract. This will elevate the ribs and pull the diaphragm down. The size of the chest cavity will increase and the pressure inside the lungs will decrease as a result of this space getting larger. Air is sucked into the lungs. In expiration, the muscles all relax, everything goes back to normal, air is pushed out of the lungs. The elasticity of the alveoli helps empty the air sacs. Not completely, but it helps push air out so we can get fresh air in later. Here you see the intercostal muscles. They're going to elevate the ribs, and the diaphragm will move downward. This will increase the space in the chest cavity, causing air to be sucked into the lungs. When everything relaxes, the ribs go back into their resting position, the diaphragm goes back into its resting position, we decrease the size of the chest cavity, and air is forced out of the lungs. Respiratory volumes are the measurements of the amount of air that's moved in and out of the lungs under certain breathing conditions. The tidal volume is your normal breathing. Each breath moves about 500 milliliters of air. That's about a pint of air. Think about the tide coming in and out at the beach. It just comes and goes sort of slowly, regularly. Tidal volume is just your normal, regular, at-rest breathing. After you have taken an inhale with tidal volume, you can always pull a little more air in. That amount of air you can take in after you have had a normal inhale is your inspiratory reserve volume. That's about 2,000 milliliters, or close to 2 quarts of air. When you normally breathe out, there's always a little more air you could force out if you really tried. This is your expiratory reserve volume, and this is about 1,200 milliliters of air. No matter how hard you try to empty your lungs, there is always a little bit of air that remains in your lungs. This helps keep the alveoli open. This is your residual volume, and no matter how deeply you inhale, all of the air you suck in through your nose does not get to your lungs. Some of it stays in the nasal passages, some stays in the trachea, and some stays in the bronchial tubes. This makes up your dead space volume, the air that enters the respiratory tract but never gets to alveoli. Vital capacity is all of the air the lungs can move. It is a measurement of your inspiratory reserve volume plus your expiratory reserve volume plus your tidal volume. We can use these various volumes and capacities to evaluate pulmonary function. All of these are influenced by age. As you get older, you tend to lose some elasticity, so you can't inhale as deeply or force as much air out. Women tend to be a little smaller than men, so their chest cavities are not as large. And if you really use your lungs a lot, you're in a little better shape than if you don't use them much at all. And then, of course, the other thing that will influence this is how healthy your lungs are. An instrument called a spirometer is used to measure the various volumes. There are some volumes we can't measure, like the inspiratory reserve volume, so we can calculate those volumes if we know the others. External respiration is the exchange of gases between the air and the blood in the lungs. Remember, this is simply simple diffusion. There's more oxygen in the lungs that naturally diffuses into the blood, and there's more carbon dioxide in the blood that diffuses into the lungs. Once we have the gases in the blood, they have to be transported. Most of the oxygen attaches to hemoglobin, making oxyhemoglobin. This is what makes oxygenated blood a bright scarlet red. Most of the carbon dioxide is carried dissolved in the plasma as bicarbonate ions. Some of the carbon dioxide will attach to hemoglobin. This makes carboxyhemoglobin, and this makes the blood look a little duller red. Internal respiration is the transfer of the gases between the blood and the tissues. Again, simple diffusion works. The blood is oxygen rich, so oxygen diffuses into the tissues. The tissues are carbon dioxide rich, so carbon dioxide diffuses into the blood. Hypoxia occurs when there is an inadequate oxygen delivery to the tissues. This can lead to cyanosis, that blue discoloration of the skin because of poorly oxygenated tissues. One of the reasons for this is anemia. In anemia, the blood has lost its oxygen carrying capacity. This can either be because there are too few red blood cells to carry the oxygen, or there may be enough red blood cells, but there's not enough hemoglobin in the red blood cells to carry the oxygen. Another cause of hypoxia is pulmonary disease. If there is some problem getting oxygen into the blood, then there won't be oxygen in the blood to carry to the tissues. And third, you can have blocked circulation. You may have oxygenated blood, but if the blood can't get to the tissue because of a clot or some other blockage, then the tissues will starve for oxygen. Carbon monoxide is a gas that is produced whenever things burn. Carbon monoxide has a higher affinity for hemoglobin than oxygen does. Hemoglobin likes carbon monoxide 200 times better than it likes oxygen. So even a little bit of carbon monoxide in inhaled air can knock oxygen off of hemoglobin, and the carbon monoxide now is carried on the hemoglobin. The tissues will die as a result of lack of oxygen, and this can happen very quickly. It can quickly cause death. This has to be treated quickly, and one of the ways they treat it is to put patients in a hyperbaric chamber. A hyperbaric chamber has a higher concentration of oxygen than normal air. By having more oxygen, we hope to knock the carbon monoxide off the hemoglobin so that oxygen can then again be carried on the hemoglobin. There are several factors that affect the rate and depth of breathing. Many of them are physical factors. When you cough or talk or exercise, you breathe at different rates. Even your body temperature can affect your rate and depth of breathing. You do have some conscious control of your breathing. When you're singing, you can control your breath. When you're swallowing, you can even voluntarily hold your breath for a while. But after a while, your brain will take over and force you to breathe. You can only use voluntary control for short periods of of time. Chemical control is one of the biggest things that controls rate and depth of breathing. Increased carbon dioxide levels are the most important factor for increasing your rate of breathing. Once you have high carbon dioxide levels, you are going to inhale. That is the thing that will overpower your conscious control of breathing. The medulla oblongata generates the basic rhythm for breathing. Most people breathe about 12 to 15 times per minute. This is known as eupnea, or good breathing. The medulla oblongata gets input from stretch receptors in the lung and from chemoreceptors in the blood vessels. If the lungs are stretched, the medulla will not allow you to inhale. If the chemoreceptors say there's not too much carbon dioxide, you won't inhale. But if carbon dioxide builds up, then you will inhale. The pons contains the pneumotaxic center. The pneumotaxic center helps fine-tune breathing during activities. Things like talking, sleeping. You continue to breathe when you sleep, but you breathe at a different rate. Hyperventilation occurs when you increase the rate and depth of breathing more than you need to remove carbon dioxide from the blood. Usually anxiety brings this on. It leads to a condition known as hypocapnia, where there is not enough blood carbon dioxide. Your cerebral blood vessels will constrict in response to this, and brain perfusion will be reduced. You won't get enough oxygen to your brain, and this will make you faint. People are told to breathe into a paper bag because as you blow out carbon dioxide into the paper bag and rebreathe it, you help return your carbon dioxide levels in your blood back to normal. There are a number of respiratory disorders, but some of the most common ones are chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, like emphysema and chronic bronchitis, asthma, tuberculosis, and lung cancer. In chronic bronchitis, inhaled irritants lead to chronic mucus production. The mucosa then becomes inflamed, and we replace elastic tissue with fibrotic scar tissue. The airways become obstructed with the extra mucus, and this impairs lung ventilation. We can't get air into the lungs, so we can't have gas exchange. These people typically experience moderate dyspnea. Dyspnea is difficulty in breathing. Smoking and environmental pollutants contribute to the development of chronic bronchitis. In emphysema, there's an enlargement of the alveoli. As a result, the alveolar walls deteriorate. Here, the elastic tissue is replaced by fibrotic tissue, so the alveoli lose their elasticity. As a result, the accessory muscles are used to breathe. Because the alveoli have lost their elasticity, they can't assist with air exchange. That is, you have to breathe extra hard to kind of chase air out of the alveoli and put new air in. The use of the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm to do this causes these muscles to fatigue, and people spend a lot of energy just trying to breathe. The pulmonary capillaries also become damaged. As they become damaged, it's harder for blood to flow through the lungs. This means the right side of the heart has to work harder, and so we overwork the right ventricle. Asthma is marked by episodes of coughing, wheezing, dyspnea, and chest tightness. There are periods of remission. Now, this is a non-progressive disease. Asthmatics have asthma attacks, but one asthma attack is not particularly worse than another. In chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, both chronic bronchitis and emphysema, these diseases slowly worsen, so they do progress. Initially, there is an inflammatory response, and then the bronchioles constrict, making it hard to move air. This leads to the tightness of the chest. The most common stimulus for an asthma attack is some allergen that's very common in the home, dust or mold spores. Tuberculosis is an infectious disease caused by the bacterium, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It is highly contagious. This is a very small organism that's easily inhaled deep into the lungs all the way into the alveoli. Those macrophages that are wandering around inside the lungs ingest the organism, but they can't kill the organism, they can't digest it. As a result, the body will collect these phagocytes that have the organism in it and will kind of wall them off. We make what's called a granuloma. Now, this walling off uses fibrosis, and there's some scarring of the lungs. Typically, however, this walling off of the organism prevents the individual from having an active case of tuberculosis. And this works as long as the immune system stays healthy. But as people age and their immune system becomes compromised by age, the tuberculosis organism may break free of this confinement, and an active case of tuberculosis may result many years after the initial infection. Lung cancer is the leading cause of cancer deaths in the United States in both men and women. The cure rate is very low. Only about 17% survive 5 years after diagnosis. It's treated by surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy to try to remove the cancer cells. 90% of people who have lung cancer are smokers. You'll remember that smoking initially stops the cilia from moving and then burns them off. Carcinogens then will alter the cells. Cystic fibrosis is a genetic disease. It's the most common lethal genetic disease in North America. The gene involved controls mucus production, sweat, and digestive enzyme activity. The digestive enzymes can be replaced, so the digestive problems can be treated fairly effectively. But the water chloride problem causes the production of an abnormally thick mucus. This will block the bronchial tubes. It also acts as a wonderful growth medium for microorganisms, particularly Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Individuals with cystic fibrosis have to have several breathing treatments every day. They also undergo a procedure known as clapping. Periodically during the day, they are hit on the back to help loosen the mucus so that it can be eliminated from the lungs. They have breathing problems and frequent lung infections. Typically, they die at a rather young age, and so far the only effective treatment is a lung transplant.